Welcome to episode number 3 of Extreme Reloading, and today we're going to talk about how to prepare brass. Don't go away. So, you've decided to reload. Maybe you're brand new at this, and this entire season is devoted to the bare necessities. In other words, just getting started. What do I need to do and what do I need to know to craft safe and reliable ammo? And we're going to carry that all the way through to extreme reloading, give you some tips. So even if you've been reloading for a number of years, you'll probably pick up a few tips and tricks along the way. So I'm going to assume you probably saw, hopefully you saw, our episode 1 and episode 2 of Extreme Reloading. If you missed those, just check out the description below. You'll find links to all of that. And then today we're going to talk about, like I said, prepping brass, one of the first actual steps in the reloading process, case prep. I'm going to assume you've already got your equipment, or at least you got your eye on getting some equipment. Where do we get our brass from in the first place? It sometimes goes like this. You bought a new rifle. Maybe it's your first rifle. Hopefully you've gotten some training on that so you handle it and use it safely and effectively. But so you got a brand new rifle. Maybe for some of you it's a brand new cartridge that you've not shot before. You didn't own it before, didn't reload for it before. And you have 0 rounds of ammo for that particular cartridge. Here's what has worked out really, really well for me. Don't just buy components and start reloading it. What I recommend that you do is you buy a variety of factory ammo. Hopefully you can find some of the bullets that you're interested in or may be interested in reloading. Hopefully you can find those things in some factory ammo. It's difficult today compared to how it was some years ago, but hopefully you can find a good selection of ammo. And when you take that factory ammo, you take it out to the range with your new rifle, and you start shooting it. Shoot it, however you like for some fun and some practice with it, but spend a little bit of time shooting some groups and getting a feel for the type of bullet that your rifle prefers. That's going to be beneficial later on when we start making some selections and buying some bullets. You can't just buy normally, 10 or 20 bullets for a given round. You can't just buy that like that. Normally, you'll buy at least 50. And very normally, you're in for 100. Well, if you buy a box of 100 of a certain bullet that just does lousy in your rifle, that's kind of a waste of money. So the other benefit of buying some factory ammo is you're going to have brass. And oftentimes we can reload brass at least 5 times, 6 times, 7 times, certainly not unheard of. Now, some of the things that reduce the lifespan of brass is if you really push it, you're loading max powder charges in that stuff, that's going to reduce the life of it. If you don't anneal, that's going to reduce the life of it. But shooting reasonable loads, that brass will last you, especially if it's good quality brass, it'll last you a really long time. Lots of reloads with that. Now there are some brands of factory ammo and obviously the brass that they use. Some stuff's better than others. If you can get, and if you're interested in purchasing some factory ammo by Lapua, I recently, about a year ago I guess, bought a box of 50 rounds of Lapua for my .308. Got that through Natchez Shooter Supply. I got Lapua brass, some more Lapua brass. That's fantastic. And they also shot really, really well in my son's .308 that we were working up loads for at that time. Some of the Federal Premium, et cetera, et cetera. There are some pretty good factory ammo out there. It'll shoot pretty well in your rifle, and sometimes you'll be able to get some pretty decent brass out of it as well. Some of that blasting brass, blasting ammo, maybe not quite so good for reloading. But even for 5.56, one of the things we're focusing on this season, 5.56, 223, Lake City is actually some pretty good brass. Lake City's good. Federal champion I've had good luck with. And of course, if you want to step it up all the way into the premiums, you got Lapua and those sorts of things there as well. The other thing that's very likely going to happen if you go out to a range, lots of other people have been out there, you're going to find brass all around. Very common, especially the range I go to, that there's 223 and 9mm, more than you could pick up, more than you care to pick up. Just hundreds and hundreds of rounds, cases out there every time I go out. I don't pick up everything. I do sometimes pick up brass, no problem with that. And I know that sometimes I will pick up brass that we shot. That's what I'm trying to do. I know that's once fired or twice fired, whatever. But I know you kind of can't help it. You're not absolutely sure when that brass falls that, I might be picking up someone else's brass with the same head stamp and all that. You can't tell them apart. So let's say you have picked up some range brass. How can you tell if it is good and safe to reload? Well, I've got a video out on that, and its link is also in the description. I call that my brass goblin video, so hopefully you can watch that and pick up some tips. That's a fairly longer video, 15-20 minutes all by itself, so I'm not going to repeat all of those points. But when we get into the brass prep steps here in just a little bit, I'm going to go through some things of what we look at with this different brass to determine if it is good brass that's going to proceed all the way through, or at least make it through a step at a time through this reloading or case prep process. So let's start into the process. One of the things you definitely want to do, I recommend, highly, highly recommend, that you buy yourself a 3-ring binder. I usually get these 2-inch 3-ring binders, and I'll be able to store a couple of years, maybe several years worth of reloading notes in these, and then I'll buy a second one and a third one. I never throw it out. I never throw out those contents because I oftentimes do want to go back to some old records, especially if I'm shooting things I may have loaded a couple of years ago. I want to go back and sometimes see some more details about how that particular load was loaded or prepared. But I have this case prep checklist, and this case prep checklist is just real simple. It's kind of the bare essentials that we're going to talk about. I do have another case prep checklist that I use, and it is designed more for the extreme type of case prep. We'll talk about that in the next episode of Extreme Reloading. But this also, I have a link in our description, is also available to you. You can download it and modify it, of course, if you want, or use it as is. This is one thing that has worked for me very, very well. Now, some of my notes might be a little bit cryptic, so I'm going to explain things as we go. So what I start off with on this checklist is I'll write down the date that I'm starting this case prep process. Normally, I can finish it in the same day. If that's not the case or not the instance, then I'll make a beginning date and an ending date. I'll enter both of those in that date section. What is the cartridge that I'm loading? Well, this one might be 5.56 NATO, whatever you want to write. And how many brass cases do I have to start with? They're not all going to make it through, maybe, but just write the number of cases that are going into this case prep process. Maybe 100, whatever. Now, I'll give you a little tips from the trenches, and this is going to vary based on your own personality, but chugging through 100, even 100 6 cases or whatever it happens to be, all the way through this in one sitting, that's a lot to ask of a person. I found that 50, 60 cases at a time, yeah, I can do that before, without suffering too much undue boredom or getting fatigue. That's the problem. It's not so much boredom, I guess, it's the fatigue. You're probably going to lose your edge in detecting things, being so careful on every single one that it's not good to, give yourself, I'm going to do 500 cases today. I can't do that, and I really don't recommend that you do that either. Well, the next step in the actual process, once we've started our records, and do this right away. Okay, don't say, well, I'll just make my notes later on. But I just take a nice lint-free cloth. I've been using this for a while. They will get filthy after a while, and you toss them away. And we clean it, okay? We're going to wipe everything off of this. And while you're doing that, you're going to take a look at that case. And one of the things I notice here is there's a dent on this 556 just below the shoulder. This may be a problem. If that dent was a little bit further up on the shoulder or on that crease of the shoulder, something like that, I'd be much more concerned with that. This probably would not be much of a problem. It'd be all right. But look for those sorts of things. Especially look for any cracks that might be in the neck, by the mouth, those sorts of things. You got to really check that, okay? Otherwise, this case looks pretty darn good. So I'm going to step through 10 of these cases and 10 9mm Luger cases, and I'm going to move that camera around so you can see what I'm doing, and I'm going to kind of commentate, give you some good notes to see and understand why I'm doing things in a certain way. Okay, well, let's start working with these 556 cases. Again, I'm going to wipe this down. I'm inspecting. Those are little dings here. Very, very common to see those things when you're shooting a semi-auto, AR-15, those type of rifles. Very, very common to see something like that. I don't normally worry about that little bit right there. I do get more concerned when that ding or dent is right up inside here. Now, the reason for that is because this rimless case, this is considered a rimless case, and that is called that in contrast to a rimmed case, such as this 303 British, which has a protruding rim, very prominent, very easy to see that. This is considered a rimless case because the case, even though it does have a rim right here, it is of the same diameter as the case body. Okay, so this is considered a rimless case. Now, this head spaces on a datum point along the shoulder itself, right here. So having this shoulder in correct and good condition so that it does headspace and doesn't cause you any headspace problems is pretty important. So I don't like to see dents right up in this area. If I do, and if they're big enough, I will chuck that case. In my case, this stuff is so easy for me to get. I don't worry about chucking it. If I don't find an excellent case, a good case, I will chuck it. This one, I'll keep it for now. So I've just cleaned that one. It's going to go into my loading block. A second one, let's take a look at this one. It's actually quite nice. You might have some pretty good sized dents along the case mouth itself, and as long as it's not almost closed up, don't sweat it. The resizing process and the expander that's going to run through that will take care of that problem. And if it doesn't, it might almost like rip it or push it down along here. If it doesn't, if it does that sort of thing, well, then chuck the case afterwards. But for right now, this looks just fine. That one's almost perfect. Just a slight little dimple right in there. Very nice little case there. If you have picked up range brass, it is a good idea to take a look at that primer. And if that primer is flattened, or if it doesn't even exist, that means if it doesn't exist, it's a blown primer, I wouldn't load that case. You don't know what other damage was done inside the head and inside the web of that case. This one is factory new. Once fired, this primer seal right here, blue in color, notice that it is applied to the case as well as the primer. So it's not like someone fired this once as factory, and then that, maybe that little bit of blue that's on the case itself right in there would retain. But the fact that we're seeing it also on the primer itself indicates this is once fired. Probably something I fired myself and just picked it right back up. Now, if you're loading pistol cases or prepping pistol cases, like this 9mm Luger here, and we'll go through a few of these. We'll go through 10 of these as well. Again, you want to wipe it down. Now, why do we wipe it down? Number one is I can see any problems with it, right? I can feel sometimes any problems with it. That's on my hands or even through this little bit of a rag right here. But the other reason why we wipe this down is I do not want any grit or silt or any sort of thing that might have been on this getting inside the die. It can scratch that die and then it's pretty much shot. You just permanently modified the die, and that's not good. A lot of your 9mm and semi-auto pistol brass will have a nickel plating on it. That's all the better. Very high lubricity helps out with the ejection. This is a good, very nice case here. And sometimes you'll pick up a case, not so common on the 9mm Luger, but much more common on the 45 ACP. Sometimes you'll pick up a case and it has a cantilever marks on the case itself. That's fine for factory ammo. That's okay, nothing wrong with that. But it causes a little bit of problems when you're reloading it, actually. And sometimes what will happen is it'll want to either have a little bit of a bulge right there as that new bullet is being seated in, or other things like that. So again, 9mm, even 45 ACP is quite common out at the range I go to, so I don't sweat those things. If I see a case with a cantilever on it that I picked up, I chuck it. Now that may not be your what you want to do, but I'll just tell you that's what I do. Now the last thing, and little tip I'll give you about 9mm Luger, is I also look at the head stamp. I look at the head stamp. What am I looking for? I'm looking for 9mm Luger. The 9mm Luger has a couple of names. 9mm Luger, 9x19, 9mm Parabellum. There may be others, but I think that pretty much covers it. And you may see head stamps with any of those different names. Now the 9x19 is kind of problematic if that's used, because if you picked up that case out at the range, you may not, at least with my eyes, I may not be 100% certain if that says 9x19 or 9x18. 9x18, that's the Makarov. And I actually have picked up some of those. Quite rare, but they do exist, and you might just pick those things up. That's not what you want to load for 9x19 Luger. You'll also maybe sometimes say, oh shoot, this is a 380. Well, this is not. This is 9mm Luger, but you might pick it up. And if you don't look at it too closely, you're almost scooping that brass up, and you say, oh gee, I picked up a 380 auto. well, chuck it. 380. You can't load that as a 9mm. So get in the habit of looking at that as well. Well, we have just finished that initial. That's an important step. What I call the wipe down step includes that general inspection. Now I'm going to set aside my pistol cases and return to the rifle cases. Now the next step for rifle cases, bottleneck rifle cases, we don't do this next step for the pistol cases, and that is lube them, right? I have tried lots and lots of different case lube. I like a spray case lube. When I first started, we were using this little foam pad. We'd squirt out this lubricant on it and rub it in and all this stuff, and we'd roll those cases across it. And that stuff would sometimes go on so thick that if you weren't careful, when you actually did resize this case, you noticed right there on the shoulder, such an important spot, all these little dimples, little dimples all the way around it. Oh, that case, you're trashing that case in. By golly, way too much lube. Sometimes some spray lubes will still put on far too much, too thick of a lube, and you'll get that same dimpling. I've never had that happen with the Hornady one-shot though. This is really some good lube. I've got, and I still have it here, some Frankfurt Arsenal, some RCBS. Oh my gosh, I got so much different lube here. But this is by far my favorite. I would recommend it. But you can try it out, whatever you like for yourself. So I'll be right back. I'm going to get these 10 cases lubed, and then we're going to go into the actual resizing process. All right, I just lubed these 10 cases, and after you finish lubing, don't run right in and start running them through the press. Give them a little bit of time to dry a little bit with this spray-on lube, and while that's drying, I like to check for what we'll call incipient case head separation or a case head fracture. What we do with that is you take a case, and something like this, you could take a paper clip and straighten it out, those sort of things. We want to get that down inside that case, and we're going to feel all along inside it, go all the way around, turn it around, and if you feel any sort of nick, a little cut, whatever it happens to be, something that's not smooth on the inside of this case, that means that you've got probably right around there, on the inside, a little cut starting to happen, and then most likely the next time you fire it, it's going to separate right there, and you got a problem. Could be a health problem. You could be injured after that. So if you feel anything, you got to chuck that case. So while it's drying, I do that. Now that doesn't take but a couple seconds each. And what you want to do is you want to make sure that your lubricant is actually very well applied right there on this shoulder. This is the place, if you don't use lube, right in here is where it's going to get stuck in that die. And if you're not careful, you'll end up ruining a nice die. So we place this in here. This happens to be an RCBS shell holder number 10. Going to bring my little cup that catches spent primers a little bit closer, and I have completely threaded in this happens to be a Hornady full-length resizing die, and we're going to run it up through the cycle. You heard it, hopefully, a little popping sound. It just ejected that spent primer, and that is it. Real easy little process. Keep these things segregated like that so you know I did not do these, but I did do those. I mean, yeah, it's pretty obvious now, but there's other stages in the process where it won't be so obvious, and if you take a phone call or whatever it happens to be, you might lose track of exactly where you are. You can also tell people, I'll call you back. This is important stuff. Now, while we're doing this, I wanted to talk a little bit more about headspace. It's kind of a scary word for a lot of people. What in the world is headspace, and where did that word come from? You know, it's kind of almost misleading today. But let me explain where that word came from. The earliest of metallic cartridges were rimmed cases. Like this 303 British that we talked about earlier, a rimmed case. Actually, one of the earliest was a 4440 by Winchester. Actually, I believe that was the first centerfire rimmed cartridge, metallic cartridge. But the first was developed by Stevens Company, and it is still around today, late 1800s. That came out, and it is the rimfire 22 long rifle. So, what's interesting, as we talk about a rimmed case, that rimmed case, when it sets into the chamber, it, if you needed to make a measurement from the rim, which is how it head spaces, right, relative to that chamber itself, well, what you would do is, and you know that this is the head of the case, you would measure the space from the head of the case to the how it fits into the chamber. You'd make a measurement of this space of the head, or in other words, as it became called, head spacing, right? Okay, that makes good sense for these. But for something like the 5.56, it doesn't quite make sense, because the 5.56 head spaces here, right up there, right there. Maybe we should call it shoulder spacing. Well, of course, we're not going to change the name. That is an entrenched name, but that's where it came from. That's what it's all about. And you know, you don't really make measurements, not at least as far as the bare essentials are concerned. Don't have that sort of instrumentation yourself. What you do is you find out whether you've done it right by using some gauges, or I guess you could do trial and error. It may not be the greatest thing in the world to do it that way. One more of these. There we go. That is done. Now, before we wrap it up for this episode of Extreme Reloading, let me talk about a couple of other case types. One, as we already talked about, is the rimless case. We also talked about rimmed cases like the 303 British, as well as the 3030 Winchester. And then we have the semi-rimmed 220 Swift. Really like this cartridge. This is a nice, fun gun to shoot. And we have the belted Magnums. This happens to be 7 7mm rem mag. Now this head spaces off of the belt. The semi-rimmed will space normally off of the rim as well. That little bit of rim will do the trick. Our 9mm Luger, how in the world does this thing head space? It head spaces. This is also considered a rimless case, but it also does not have a bottleneck, a shoulder, to head space off of. So instead, it head spaces off of the mouth. And when we get to that part of testing the final round, the final finished cartridge, we're going to do some testing to make sure that it will head space correctly. I'll show you some tricks on how to do that at that point. We're a little ways away from that. But we're going to stop for now, and we will continue working with case prep in the next episode of Extreme Reloading. We're going to be talking about length measurements, various different measurements we make on these cases, and kind of finish all the way through the case prep process. And we're also going to be start talking about how to, if you want to call it, kick it up a notch. Extreme case preparation. Thanks for watching. Hey, if you've got some questions, comments, or other ideas, maybe you've got some tips from the trenches to help others in their reloading, or help me out even with some new tips, that'd be great. Go ahead and post those in the comments. Thanks for watching.